Welcome, whether you are here live with us in the building or when you are with us through digital means. Welcome. Good afternoon. We are voluntary prisoners gathered in a parking garage of all places. Normally, only cars meet here, or criminals. We are in the building and the level is -5. The temperature is +12. It's always +12. When you would return here in 100 years, the temperature would still be +12. So the sanity of the organizers is doubtful, having the guts to invite us exactly here on a place like this. But in one respect, it may make sense that we are exactly here. It was also in a cave where the origins of architecture can be located, at least when we believe the big writers in architectural theory. Read Vitruvius, read Alberti, and you see the story and you see the story reconstructed that people assembled around a fire to get warm. Could be a good idea here as well. Around this fire they learned the joy of meeting. They learned the joy of agreeing and disagreeing. They also learned to explore the benefits of crafts, the benefits of learning carpentry and masonry and all the other things that you have to know before you can start making architecture. Mastering the crafts. Mastering the crafts, it means controlling the crafts. But long after these scenes in the first caves, things ran out of hand. Essentially, architecture is about controlling the crafts. And of course it still is. It is why we developed a discipline with an extensive range of competences. And we used this discipline to organize people, to organize animals, to organize things in a maintainable order. But as I said, things ran out of hand. You will possibly remember the Chaplin movie Modern Times. The eating scene, well, all the people coming from Eindhoven will know it because we use it each year in a theory course. What we see here is that the balance between control and being controlled is clearly disrupted. Disrupted hard. And after this scene, technology went on to spread its wings. Does it import the emancipation of us all? Was it for our benefits? Well, perhaps we can say that we are no longer in control anymore and that we are being controlled more than we would like. The material world, the technological devices that were originally defined to be helpful have started on their own. Our fate is perhaps to succumb. Our fate may be to defend. Our fate is perhaps also paranoia. And when I think of paranoia, the first man who comes to my mind is Husnu Janolu, in Eindhoven, the inventor of the critical intermediate affairs. And he will try to shed a light on what will happen this afternoon. Husnu.
Okay, thank you for this introduction. I hope I am not too paranoid today. So let's give a little brief information to you people what we like to do. So we started up in Eindhoven with a graduation studio called Architecture in a Hyper-Liquid World to get access to this hyper-modern times, which is a little bit further down Charlie Chaplin. And we start up to have some kind of framework, and our framework, to make it a little bit more concrete, based on 4, let's say, perspectives. The first perspective is related to the sociologist Zygmunt Bauman's approach, what he's saying about liquid modernity. He's saying that the permanence is only the change, and uncertainty is the only certainty. The second perspective was of sociologist Manuel Castells. He is combining a new space, let's say the space of flows with the space of places, which is a reality in our times. The third perspective is from the futurist Ray Kurzweil. He wrote a really challenging book about, the title is The Age of Spiritual Machines, in which he is actually saying that computers will exceed human intelligence pretty soon. So finally, we put it together, let's say, these different perspectives in a certain hypothesis. And the hypothesis is related to the philosopher Gilles Lipovsky. He's coming up with this notion of hypermodernity. And he is saying hypermodernity is characterized by permanent movement, fluidity, and permanent flexibility. So what does this mean actually for space, for architecture, for the culture of architecture, to think about architecture and to make design about architecture, if the virtual world is becoming more and more dominant in relationship to the world as we now have here in this parking lot? So how can we deal with that as a designer, related to our bodies, to our buildings, to our cities? What does it mean actually? Do we have any tools of architecture and urban design that could have any relevance in order to reflect on that, on this ongoing high-speed movement and transformation? So in order to get access to that, we organize now a brief debate. It's a huge field, what we are talking about, but we need to actually bring it down to something that could be discussed in 1.5 hours. We do have some guests for that. Bernard Kohlenbrunner, he will, let's say, will be the person in charge to deal with the debate. One of our guests is Gordon Jack. So Gordon Jack is an architect and working for Van Aken Architects, and he's very much involved in this development because Van Aken Architects is also one of the architecture offices working for Eindhoven for the ASML, and creating actually a lot of new technological spaces in which is needed to produce actually this high-tech development. The other one is Dirk van den Heuvel. He's an architect and chair of the Jaap Bakkema Study Center. And our third guest is Tjerk Timman, a policy researcher at TNO, the Netherlands Organization for Applied Scientific Research. So the last part is how are we organizing our Paranoid meeting today is based on 3 parts. Each part will start out with a pitch. The first pitch is, we call it, and each pitch will be started with a student of 5 minutes, let's say. The copy of the first pitch is, we call it humanizing technology. This pitch is much more focusing on that technology is not only a tool, as we know, for a long period. Technology is becoming actually part of our body, you can say, if you think about the iPhone as an example. So we will discuss on that and related to some buildings which might be also relevant to get the link with architecture, like Apple Store and Apple Park. The second pitch is related to other topic, because this big data development has, on the one hand, created for us a huge opportunity to have access to knowledge, at least to information. Information is knowledge, we know that, but at least information. But on the other hand, this huge big data development, artificial intelligence and this kind of stuff is also the key element of a smooth way of surveillance and control. So what does this mean actually in the discipline of architecture? This is actually the second pitch. And the third pitch is related, we called it the rise of the man-machine landscapes. This is actually related to a development which is becoming more and more relevant. There are more and more, let's say, spaces where no human is involved at all. Artificial landscapes like big data or data centers, but also factories where products get produced with very little or no human intervention. So this will be the 3 pitches, and we will start up with the first pitch, and I hope you will have an interesting debate. You will be a participant in this interesting debate. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Husni, but before you leave the table, let's come to a crucial question in the beginning, before we start with the presentations. It is obvious, I think, that the digital revolution and that the dispersal of artificial intelligence, etc., first of all, creates a virtual world. Now, the happy thing is that architecture is exactly the opposite. It is the real material world par excellence. So one might easily assume, don't worry, dear architects, don't worry, go on. Realize your beautiful buildings, just like you did before. There's no reason to worry, is there?
I mean, if you are paranoid, I would think in this way. But if you are a little bit smart and you will also take account and think about let's say, the purpose of our discipline, which is always changing related to technological, social, political, etc., power-related relationships, it was always a part of our domain. So, I mean, if you look as an architectural historian or theory, architecture is always some kind of reflection on ongoing transformations. And technological transformations has been always a very important part of that. So if you would say now, let's have a cappuccino and everything is fine, no reason to have any doubts about, then I would say something is going really wrong.
Okay, that's why we are today in this cave. Okay, thank you very much about this. And now we are almost starting with the first case study. But before we're going to do that, I want to inform the audience, both at home and here with us, that there's a possibility to intervene in the discussion if you like, using the papers on the chair when you're with us, or use the digital device on your computer, whatever that is. So now we turn to the first of the 3 case studies. The first case study will be presented by Xu Willemsen, and the basic term that applies to this first presentation is humanizing technology. The floor is for you.
Thank you very much for that introduction. So my name is Meuwissen, and I will briefly talk about the topic of hypermodernity and the role in Apple's architecture within this. So first, let's start with a small introduction of hypermodernity. So Luciano Floridi approaches the topic of hypermodernity through increasing digitalization in a physical world. From this, societies are becoming more and more dependent on the digital in order to create and develop their social welfare. And for societies to become more dependent, the links between different digital devices is key. Thus, the more links and nodes there are within a digital network, the better a digital society can function. Hypermodernity thrives on data collection, on data analysis, and eventually it can be used to influence users' behavior. And in this sense, Apple as a brand is no different than any other electronics companies. But then how is it that Apple stands out, that Apple sets itself apart from these other companies? During our analysis, we refer to this as the Apple vacuum. So it's the image of Apple that lures users into the vacuum that is the digital world. How does this image, or how does Apple communicate their strong image, the feeling of exclusivity, and the pleasing aesthetics that they offer the user? Well, they do this through physical anchors, tangible matters like product design and architecture, because these have the ability to create an immediate understanding of what Apple is about and what Apple stands for to the users. An example of this is Apple Park 2, located in Cupertino, California. It's also referred to as the Infinite Loop building, and it's claimed to be one of the most innovative buildings of this time. And in the renders that you can see here, Foster and partners present Apple Park 2 as a very transparent and accessible building. But in the physical reality, Apple Park 2 is non-accessible for you and me. Only the most valuable employees of Apple can get into this park. There is no visual connection from surrounding roads, and the building is so gigantic that the sense of human scale and human connection is replaced by emptiness. This building is used by Apple as a physical anchor through which Apple can visualize what they stand for, what their image is, through architectural elements. The building serves the purpose of representing and communicating the image of Apple to the users. Also in the Apple stores, this architectural appearance comes back, so the strong image that Apple wants to pursue. So when these stores, they have the same aesthetics, and when one is in these stores, they feel almost consumed by the Apple atmosphere, and they become a part of this Apple community. Thus, the image that Apple wants to pursue is one of their leading or main drivers in architectural design. This then makes us question, has technology affected, for example, classical architectural elements? And how has the notion of a theme like transparency changed because of the rising of the digital? Transparency used to stand for a medium, to open up closed spaces, where a means of simultaneous perceptions of spatial locations is possible. But if we cannot reach Apple's buildings anymore in a physical world, then what's left of the notion of architectural elements like transparency? Do they then only become a tool to represent things of the digital world, like the Apple devices and the Apple image? Thus, the closing question can then be, has an architectural element like transparency gained an extra dimension because of the rising of the digital, or is the digital actually limiting classical architectural elements and turning them into means towards a digital end? Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Xu. Will you join us on the table? It gives me the opportunity to introduce the panel. On my right hand, I have Gordon Jack, who's an architect of Van Aken Architects and very much involved in issues that are similar to issues that are also playing a role in Apple, I think. Then we have Jack Tiemann, who's a policy analyst at the TNO. Very welcome. And on my left hand, I have Dirk van den Heuvel, associate professor in Delft. Well, Xu, Apple. Jack.
Oh.
Do you like to intervene in this case study?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting to talk about the design and the image of Apple as this front runner of the good and the sleek. And when I think back at my own practices and uses and of these ICT tools, that you see that actually what they do and what they have set the tone or the archetype for is obfuscation by design, right? So you see it in the physical shops, in the experience, it should be friction-free. And that is something they don't do themselves alone, but they were one of the first to do that both in hardware and software to make sure that you're not bothered by technology. And what this actually does is, for me, it moves us further away from what is behind. So this whole image of sleek and being accessible actually takes us further away from what it is. And the risk in that I see is that this image becomes more important than what is going behind. And this logics, what are going behind, is actually where where all the stuff happens. So this I think is interesting as a kind of cultural image of what Apple is. On the other hand, if you're a bit critical, they lost the curve on setting the tone and claiming the archetype. They claimed the archetype of the smartphone. They claimed the archetype before of the computer. Every design and architect office had an Apple. They claimed the archetypes of the type of offices. But you see that now they've been repeating the same thing. So what is new? And what is new there is the game in the ICT world and also in Apple has moved from hardware to software. So the next battle is in AI and in backward systems that we as a consumer have no real insight into anymore. And I think that is interesting that whole discussion of hardware and archetypes that were very visual and also very haptic, the Cupertino white and the sleek phones and the super nice designed object to have, also as a status symbol, is a bit gone, and the digital doesn't replace the same thing. Of course, there's an Apple Store and there's particular ways of interaction design, but they're not the front runner there anymore. So I'm very curious, what is the next kind of winner in setting this sleek, hyper-modern image and pushing us to what is the next frontier? So for my feeling, we're a bit stalling. And in my personal experience, and then I'll stop, is that I think for me, the image of an Apple Store, for instance, is it's interesting in one way from a very kind of American customer journey experience. But as a technologist and a designer and a developer, it's very frustrating because it's like being in a candy store, but you cannot touch anything, and there's no fiddling anymore. There's no Avalon type of let's play with stuff.
Yeah.
So this pushes you away as well from what made Apple so special, and that is that you could tinker and play and be part of that community, of that image. And now you're pushed as a consumer of that image and not anymore a brand co-developer. And I think that is a bit how I see Apple now if I look at this kind of representation.
Yeah, yeah. You look at Apple as a brand in the first place and how they manifest themselves on a variety of practices, but more specific, their responsibility in architectural terms. You must recognize something in their approach to buildings issue and to design issues.
Of course, I mean they're trying to be the front runner in creating a sustainable image for themselves, good quality materials, sustainable, and also in terms of the community. If you look though at first of all, the Apple stores themselves are quite context-less. As in terms of architecture branding, they're really related to their own product. So they're very sleek design, very elegant, high-end, very efficient. But what is interesting is that it is, I mean, in terms of architecture, their architecture is kind of very neutral. It's the same as the iPhone. The iPhone is kind of a device which you can access and get information from. The architecture that they create, like the reference of Fifth Avenue, is very, I mean, it's not that special, I would say. What's very interesting about what Apple do is the relationship or the positioning themselves within cities, the physical world. So it's their physical interface for their digital product is associated with very important cultural locations within major cities. For example, Fifth Avenue, but also in the Champs-Élysées in Paris or in Regent Street in London. They have this very unique ability to position themselves in a physical world where you start to associate this elegance, this quality. I mean, one of the great examples is having a shop in Grand Central Station, which nobody else could do. But Apple, as soon as you come into Grand Central Station, you have this beautiful iPhone experience of like Apple shop experience. They're associating themselves in a physical world. To already a piece of architecture which is of cultural importance that already then kind of like elevates their own, let's say, their own architecture to a higher level without really doing very much. But basically they take their very simplistic, elegant architecture design, they associate it in a very important predominant location within cities, and then with that combination create a very good strategy, a good branding strategy for them.
A good branding strategy, brilliant business. That's what we can say of it. Yes. So when you investigated this for the studio in Eindhoven, did you do it with? Did you understand from the beginning, instantly, what the relationship was between the Apple issue and architecture at large?
Well, not from the beginning, but as soon as, because we had Apple Park 2 in Cupertino to analyze, But we immediately felt with the group like there is somehow a mismatch. I don't know exactly where they are communicating everything that they implemented in the architecture of Apple Park 2, where it is for, because no one can see it from there. And then, of course, we kind of came to the realization that it's of the image of Apple and that they somehow transmit this image through the digital to kind of spread and connect to these users and then tell them like, hey, this is what we are about. And they show that via the architectural elements. So then we started to think like, oh, it's really interesting branding and it's very smartly put up in that way to indeed connect people to the digital via these physical anchors and the things that people still understand.
Do you think that the building, that their main building that they created for themselves, that it supports the branding strategy as well?
Yes, I think so, because they did. For example, also the facades, they had to create completely new technologies for that to create the curved panorama panels. So, and it's also I believe one of the most expensive buildings ever built. But if you look from the surroundings, it's not visible. So I really think that this is especially done to still show them and tell people that this is like Apple that's there.
Well, but I would say, but then I go to Dirk also with this question, then I say there's nothing new with this. What Apple does, use the brand as something that plays a role from the smallest detail to the biggest object. Well, it's all about industry. When we can refer, Dirk, and you probably also know the example of Peter Behrens and AEG in Berlin. That was about design, but also about buildings. It was actually about everything. So what's new? There's nothing new here, right?
Well, that's a nice statement. There's nothing new, but it's always a new variation on things that we know from the past, maybe. That's what you can say there's new. What I find interesting about this development and why you are looking at Apple and the different questions of where is architecture is that it's a new phase for Apple as well as a multinational or as a company, because Apple was never before involved in developing architecture and using architecture for branding or for building its offices, etc. It was before very much anti-architecture, I would say. So now the system of the digital and Silicon Valley calls in the system of architecture. I'm really curious what is happening there, because there are different systems, of course, and you can use them for different purposes. So how does this assemblage of systems then is going to work and going to further push us into the future? I mean, I find it quite interesting to watch. It's a bit scary, and the paranoia.
I don't know if it's scary, but it's interesting that you remark that the building is actually the pinnacle of a development that started with the earliest developments that they did, inventions that they made, that needed no architecture at first. They simply needed a production facility. But now at the end, the story is finished. Now they also have a building which actually supports the brand just as the telephone does. Yes. Do you recognize that the necessity to have all the components of the brand?
Yes, of course. I mean, like we haven't even talked about the back of house, which is like the facilities that actually build the iPhones. They're not a part of the branding exercise at all at this moment in time. Perhaps in time they will become more in the forefront of it. But it is, you have multiple different things. You have the facilities that make the product themselves. You have the people who engineer it, and then you have people who sell it. What they kind of like those kind of components. Each of them play an integral role in the overall branding of the business itself. At the moment, what is very interesting to see is like now the Apple Park 2 is becoming also, like what you said before, it was a standard office that the Apple had before, as well as all these high-tech companies. Now the offices are becoming a part of the branding, the lifestyle, how you're kind of creating a community, how you're engaging with the local surroundings, how you're helping society, creating jobs, etc. That's all a part of branding. Whether or not it is a good building or not, that's another discussion. But it's all a part of that. The end goal of essentially what it is to sell a product in the end. And if what we're seeing also, like the back of house, where the facilities are now making these productions are coming a little bit more into the forefront, where they want to showcase. You see also with the Amazon companies, want to kind of like advertise and promote how efficient they are, how well they can basically produce or basically the automated systems. That will become also another important factor in the kind of the overall branding eventually.
Jack, I want to add something to the discussion that we did not yet discuss yet. It starts with Apple with a brand and a variety of manifestations of the brand. But this topic is presented under the label of humanizing technology. And the building that they just produced for as a main office is maybe the pinnacle. But I think that humanizing technology has also kind of a prophecy or a promise. And that promise is that the end is not the building, but the end is to control behavior. I simply want to refer to the famous book, of which I of course forgot the title, of Dave Eggers.
The Circle.
The Circle. The Circle, which indeed shows that it does not stop with the building. There's more to it.
Yeah, well, the circle is of course well chosen because it was not for nothing a relation to this infinity building, although it says more about the other search engine / advertising company than it says about Apple, but it's a bit the same. The point is that, I don't know, there's a couple of things to say about that. The first is, I think that if you look at the building like that, it's a particular statement, and that statement is now, in hindsight of a year of COVID and working back from home, it's a bit of a strange thing to do, to build a very pompous building where you want people to go to, where actually, and here I agree with my speaker on the left, that these buildings are not anymore about the place where you work, but it's more about showing what you stand for in terms of human technologies. And in that sense, for me, the building was not so much in the news in terms of architecture and Apple in the last couple of years, but more the kind of advertising they did about privacy and about taking a political stance against. So you see that these companies, they have this kind of need to, and very pragmatically also for Apple, it's a way to get rid of some surplus money. At some point you need to put it into something, so let's make this huge big building to as a crown to that 10, 20 years.
$5 billion investment in the park.
Yeah, and that is one way, but I think the other way that they want to address this human technology part, and which is kind of interesting, is that you see now that these statements that used to be very far away from the corporate world about quality of life, about taking care of your workers, but also about responsibility, sustainability, and also privacy, these kind of values, now start to become kind of core of the next message of, if we want to do this well, we need to make it human-centered, and look at us, we are already leading the way. So we do take care of your privacy, and we do that, and they actually do that very well. So we saw, and as a privacy and surveillance scholar back in the days, I found it very interesting that move was, first they didn't want to talk about these things, and now the human was more a consumer, and now you see that the human element it's more than only a branding. There's also a really idea that if we want to do this on the long run, these kind of values become not only key selling points or key kind of messages, but there's something underlying as well about they have a major influence on where this technology is going, and they show that also in these type of buildings to push that, but also in making the statements, being politically almost active with this kind of billboard. So they also physically show themselves in the space to make these kind of statements where 10, 20 years ago they would not bother with that, right? They would say, where that's not politics, is not what we want to dabble in so overtly. So I thought that was interesting that, of course, this building was in the news, but for me, the billboards on their privacy statements against the Googles and the Facebooks were, for me, the interesting thing to see as a manifestation in public space on their values and how they put the human-centered actually as a kind of next step to, all this AI and big data in the back end, that's one thing, but we need to make sure that we keep it to the front and we keep it human. And that, I think, is an interesting kind of political, but also social statement in a way. I don't know if you wanted to go there, but that's kind of my reflection on it.
Finally, before we get to the next case study, thank you, Jack. Doing this project, Sue, what did it do? What has it done for your definition of what architecture really is?
Well, it did make me think of how it would slowly start to evolve, because then I kind of saw when we analyzed Apple Park that already how they use transparency and connectivity and accessibility, that it is in the building there, like the ingredients are there, but the people that should make use of it are not there anymore because it has become this physical anchor and this means to a digital world. So I'm not sure where it's going to take us, but it's definitely interesting to see these architectural elements start to change much more and become also a way of representing transparency instead of like really interacting or creating transparency in a physical world. So I think, it's interesting, but it could also be like a limit, for architectural elements.
Thank you for being with us. We move to the next case study. And now the things become more serious. Now it's not anymore on humanizing technology, but the next step is surveillance and control. So there we are. Narindat Maria will present part of his graduation project. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Surveillance has always been a broad topic that held specific narratives that resulted in ideas of unleashed power, fear, and control. But the aspect of surveillance being instinctual to people and the systems that people made seems to be besides the point. In the hypermodern, surveillance follows three self-evident components: the economic market, technocratic efficiency, and the individual. The position today considers surveillance as a machine that has transposed the culture of suspicious behavior and self-correction to a more continuous operation of modernizing. Through spatial design, surveillance can be read in the city. The animated city considers surveillance through the human gaze, which gives an allure of community. The panoptic city regards surveillance through cameras, that gives a presence of safety and control. And the entrepreneur city engages surveillance through technology, to give an impression of efficiency. All in all, surveillance is merging all spaces with multiple narratives, devastating the boundaries of the physical space, and the issue of privacy is gone to the wind. In the physical space, technical artifacts all work together to expand the flow of data. Equally, technical softwares work symbiotically to organize mass data in a post-structural surveillance scope by linking information to data doubles. The virtual space is an economic space that is seeping into all life spheres, and the surveillance principle, mechanism, and authority are at the heart of gathering, collecting, and influencing. No longer the notion of life away from the virtual surveillance space. The infrastructures are in place. Individuals are connected, and the virtual is the land infinite. Rooted in the physical, surveillance has leaped into the virtual. The registry of the self is seamless in the surveillance machine, and the accumulation of knowledge is boundless. And with the abundance of data leads to a strong potential for knowledge. With the vast amounts of information circulating the globe, it is no surprise that humans have left the field of trying to understand this, but instead adapted machine systems to render valuable information at a moment's need. The meaning applied to information is now beyond the scope of the human, and the mediation of machine intelligence is needed. Therefore, is it accurate to suggest that meaning is only provided through technical mediation? In my thesis, it became curious to wonder, is surveillance so seamless in the context of the real and the virtual that the only way to become aware of this is to go through some form of architectural experience, like an initiation, that will leave the individual provoked to the ongoing things, to the hidden layer of the virtual and the all-encompassing aspect of surveillance? In my thesis, I focused on the virtual panopticon as an architectural space, depicting the contemporary form of collecting individuals' information and then recycling this information back to people as prediction. This curiosity was the driving force behind these illustrations. Is it then a potential for architecture to produce experience to put forth the pervasive systems of surveillance? And what tool does architecture have to gain a form to the virtual aspect of surveillance? Thank you for your attention.
I invite you to join us on the table, at the table, Narindat.
This horrible table.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. One of the side effects of being in a cave is that acoustics are terrible. So you need to help us out.
Yes.
And I did not really grasp the core of your graduation project, which came under the flag of surveillance and control.
Yes. I began to saw in my architectural thesis that surveillance was becoming all-pervasive. And I was starting to wonder what form could architecture give this. And because of the inheritance of the panopticon and architecture and its inheritance, I started to view the idea of the panopticon being a virtual theater. So I designed a space that would be representative of a virtual theater. Although my architectural project...
You designed a theater, that was the topic?
The thesis was based on surveillance, and it was a building that was constructed as a system. So it illustrated both the system of gathering data, processing data, and then recycling data.
Okay, but I still don't have it completely sharp.
Okay. What I tried to find is that how could I represent surveillance physically, but with its virtual behaviors. And it was basically connected to the surveillance capitalism idea from Susanna Schuboff, with her ideas that data is being collected and recycled, not just for the interface, but for people.
Okay. Now we're getting into in the foggy world of how privacy is controlled by surveillance.
Yes.
Is that playing a role at an arc and daily practice? These kind of issues?
No, but maybe I can add something extra, because actually, listening to your presentation for 5 minutes there, we've actually done a theoretical project similar to this. It was based on the Panopticon's buildings, the koepels, the prisons that were built here in Haarlem, Arnhem, and one other Breda also.
Yeah.
And because they came up on the market for sale to be renovated, and of course they were based on the theory from Jeremy Bentham of this kind of like reformation from not knowing if you're being surveilled at what time. So the prisoners are all in a physical building and they do not know if they're being watched. So the idea is that you reform yourself without that intervention of being surveilled. And what we had as a project was, and I think it's maybe similar to what your project is about, is to kind of like to bring as a to try to show to the people, to us as a community now, what is actually online is not visible.
Yeah.
So what we had as a theory was that we, instead of having a couple where one person looks out and the people are in the cells, you could invert it so that you, when you're in the building itself, you're literally projected with all your digital life. You're literally taking your digital world and putting it on a display so that you can actually physically see it. And it's quite confrontational, because then you realize just how significant the data is being mined on you at any given point in time. I'm sitting here right now, I have my 4G on, Google knows where I'm sitting, they know who I'm interacting with because we are all in the same situation, same hall here. And so, and it's also like the interactivity of who's going online. If I look you up later on LinkedIn, for example, everything is being collected on you, and that kind of like interface is very exciting as a kind of like very confrontational. If you have a certain, I guess that's what your image is about,
yes.
And somewhat like that, where you're almost awkwardly presented this amount of data and information towards you, and whether it's a good or bad thing, I don't know. It depends on what you do, I guess. Mm-hmm. If you feel like it's an issue or not.
But let's bring it back to a basic issue. But I can also ask you Narindat. When you refer to these prisons, to the panopticon, then it's easy to represent it as a type.
Yes.
But now, when we look at the new definitions of surveillance and control, can we bring it to the general representation of a type, or is that
Yes, that was indeed something that I struggled with my thesis, because with the type aspect, you're basically confronted with also the inheritance of what that type represents. So for instance, surveillance with Bentham represented a type of self-correction and a self-regulation. But we see now that surveillance as a principle has evolved. So how to then show this evolution in a type, but is a type enough to even show that? Because now we're dealing with something that is very instantaneous, where data and influence from data is happening in the moment without, and what I suggested, seamlessly.
All right. Is this issue playing a role at TNO's research desk?
Well, depends. If I speak from my personal account, before I worked at TNO, I was an academic researcher.
Yeah.
My PhD was in surveillance studies, so I have dabbled in this for a while. And TNO is really an applied research institute, so what we actually do is we try to understand these themes of surveillance and data and digitization and see what actually you can do about that. So there's a big field that's called privacy by design, of course, that looks at solutions of data privacy from a technological point of view. So how can you protect data, data security? But wider than that, and of course now in the world that we move to AI and predictions, it's not even real time, it's in the future, right? So the real time is already past us. So that becomes interesting, because then the ideas and the tools we have, both methodologically in the design phase as well as in the kind of institutional and democratic after protections, they don't hold anymore. So for instance, a GDPR, a General Data Protection Regulation in Europe that's supposed to protect citizens against massive data grabbers, it works to a certain extent, but if you think about these new types of systems that are made based on predictions and profiling, the problem is the harm is not individual, so it's not about me. I am not interesting as a unit in the statistics. It's about a particular profile that I represent and in a particular demographic. And Deleuze already wrote about this in 1980, way before Zuboff was even thinking about this topic. He already coined the individual to say it's about the divided individual, and this individual is represented in particular databases. And what changes in surveillance is that the goal of surveillance in Bentham was to, Bentham made the panopticon because he was against physical punishment. He thought that was barbaric, so he thought we need to re-educate citizens towards the good life. In commercial surveillance and this individualism, it's the market, it's companies that are not interested in a higher goal of re-educating you. So the goal of surveillance had a purpose of a particular good political behavior in a particular time. But now that we lose that, the idea of surveillance is not a political project anymore, it's a market project. And that changes, that's one thing, so that really changes where this takes place. It's not the state versus a citizen, but it's way more companies versus consumers, and that's a really different arena. And what you see in this kind of, we had the last 10 years this whole privacy by design and engineering field that we as TNO work a lot in, so how can you actually make sure that you can share data in a secure way. That's a new topic as well, multi-party computation, where you can actually, untrusted parties can share data without ever knowing from each other that they do so. So there's a lot of technological advancements in data sharing, but that doesn't fix the problem of the intention of surveillance. So who is doing this and why? And the interesting thing is that the big tech companies of these days, they're not even interested anymore so much in your consumer behavior, because that's all predicted, that's done. It's now about workplace optimization, the Amazon warehouses and these kind of things, and there it's, but also the Uber drivers that are controlled by an algorithm and these kind of stuff, and that is hyper surveillance on the task, but they're not so interested in surveilling this person, they're surveilling a particular work process that needs optimization, right? So this surveillance and optimization, that is really the new topic. And in that sense, I find it interesting that this kind of spaces are, what does that mean in a physical world again? That is very difficult, because our interface to that world, to maybe we have smart CCTV cameras still, but that we could physically interact with, or we could hide our faces, but now, because we have that phone in our pocket, and we have the smart sensors in smart cities, all the surveilling takes place in algorithms way hidden, so we cannot push back or hide or find alternative routes or divert this type of surveillance. And that makes it really new because it's something we don't really understand. Why is this happening and who is doing this and for what purpose? Because the purpose of Bentham and back in the day was to make us all good citizens, but that's no longer the purpose. So where is this going? And that I think is interesting, and how you can reflect that in architecture would be very interesting to understand what these data flows actually do to us feeling also surveilled and feeling controlled. Because sometimes we do it voluntarily and we don't mind. We also live in a time of exposure culture. Hille Koskela wrote a brilliant paper already 10 years ago about how we are willingly participate, and this exposure culture is sometimes also empowering, that we can have this way to express ourselves and to show ourselves and to share data. But so it's always a power balance between who claims that space and what can I do with that? And is that data mine to curate or is it none, and what does that do? And I think projects like this can really help in we need to have better images or mirrors to reflect what that data says about us, and then the next step is to see what you can do about that. But to come back to your question, we do a lot on this privacy by design and data protection in engineering point of view, and we also connect that to legislation and regulation, and we advise governments on what is coming. But in this whole datafication and AI world, this is not so clear yet what is going to happen.
Yeah. Hey, Dirk, finally, I want to turn to you because I can imagine that these topics of digital surveillance are a surprise to you. But much of our research has been focused on the 70s, on Bakema, Van Eyck, in a period when these kind of topics were actually under the carpet, not playing a role at all. It was just.
Yes and no. So at the new institute with the Bakema Study Center, we've been already looking into the archives to the prehistory of the digital, so to speak, because the whole internet that we have today, the data centers, etc., they didn't come just out of the blue. There's a prehistory. So data centers or rekencentra, they have been built and designed before. As buildings, they immediately come with surveillance technologies. So each of those buildings you see on the photos, for instance, that's also interesting, that are immediately considered high-risk locations. They immediately come with their own gated sort of technologies, guards and cameras and all that. It's all first about the computer room, which has to be completely secure, clean and hygienic, which is almost like a religious space of that new machine where data and information is being processed and produced. So what is interesting about that moment is that actually when you have, so it overlaps with structuralism in Dutch architecture. It has relations with systems theory, with Noam Chomsky, for instance, who was playing with the notion of deep structure, which was later considered a fallacy, and language theory. What's interesting is that the architects try to develop a language that ties in with this same systems theory. And structuralism is really, as a formalist language of architecture, super well tuned to do this. And there are beautiful data centers done. Rudy Bleker did one. Also in the campus in Enschede, there's a beautiful data center or rekencentrum. Interestingly, it's not only universities, it's also banks. The first data centers are for banks immediately, and the ABN AMRO data center of the early 70s was by Van der Broek and Bakema for Amstelveen, with a cable directly to Schiphol already, not as an internet hub, but immediately connected to the big infrastructures of communication technology. So there is a kind of way how we're in this parking garage, but I don't think it's a coincidence, to be honest. I think the geological and the planetary system of how the infrastructure network is being built, or what Benjamin Breton called the accidental megastructure. This is something that's being developed in various waves. And these data centers of the 70s, they were very much part of it. And the architecture had already then some sort of idea about it, how to develop it, mixed with, that's interesting, brutalist sort of style of architecture.
Yeah.
So there's this super interest in material associations, connotations, meanings, which we might now today think of as affordance theories or effect theory, bypassing the more old school functionalist models, but indeed connecting the material immediately to the electronic and the digital. That's always, we're always talking about electronic things here. Yeah. That's very important to realize this.
But that's interesting that this electronic world was disguised, as it were, in a brutalist camouflage.
I think it's not disguised. I think it really goes together. The one goes, I think it's also what you see with the current blockchain technology, how it's developed. It needs high energy, it needs stable environments. I mean, in terms of geology, in terms of climate stable. Those environments are spaces like we are in now. So the flexibility and the hyperliquidity that we talk with, they necessarily come with geologically stable constructs or environments.
Okay, that's interesting to know, but that brings me also to the question that I want to ask to you. Working at Van Aken, of which we all know that they are very much involved in ASML.
Yes.
So in ASML you will have circumstances that may be similar to the data center to which Dirk refers, of the 1970s. But I don't have the idea that you have the inclination to dress it in brutalist architecture or something.
No, but nowadays, like for the clean room environment, as I was saying earlier in the previous speaker, it's now becoming some sort of a branding marketing exercise where it's no longer just a box that is a function that the form follows the function. Now it's this nice blend. It's actually becoming an integral part of, not as, you have data centers and clean room, high technology buildings that are isolated away from the human view, but they're also now in really the heart of communities and are becoming a very important impact to have high quality architecture, something that's integrated with the landscape, something that's integrated with the surrounding buildings. And I think that we're not brutal. If you're going to design a brutalist building for, I think it could be very interesting, very beautiful to do. It is, why not? It is almost like you're creating what you have here is something so robust and something so monolithic that what happens inside almost doesn't matter. It's like the beauty, the kind of like the strength and encasing of the outside. What is an influence of architecture for these types of high-tech buildings is that you almost want to create a building that represents strength, robustness, and efficiency, but also security and also reliability.
That's what architecture has to do.
That's what architecture has to do, so that when you start to look at these high-tech facilities, you see like, okay, this is a building where I can put my data, my information, and I'm certain that happens. But that's not how it is in the real world at this moment, because they are hidden away. And that's from
Can I ask a question?
Yes, you can. Yes, you.
Because I was watching your project, and to me it had connotations of a disco club.
Yeah, okay.
And but you were talking about a theater, for instance.
Yes.
So I was wondering whether there is, because we talk about surveillance and control, etc. But there's also other ways of how the technology is being used for emancipation and liberation, and so there's a whole layered sort of reality there, where also groups and communities, well, they control themselves, but they can also control their new identity. So I was wondering if your project was also involved in those
Yes,
new
I think
things.
I think what you describe is like the spectrum of surveillance, and that is not so much based on like the fear and control, but it's also about liberation and enlightenment at sometimes also. I think one of the main aspects of my project was to be provocative. So I wanted to very much confront the public with this idea of surveillance. And one of the main aspects that I thought was that it was seamless because we weren't so aware of what was happening to our data and what was influencing us also. So a main part of my project and also the drawings was to be very provocative and to bring about also a space that seemed very machine-like and foreign.
May I ask her one question?
Yes, sure.
I mean, maybe
Go ahead.
also, you know, but is there a platform at the moment where you can physically access all the information that is being gathered upon you online right now? Do you know from your research if that is the case,
No, I don't know.
Because it's based on your project. The
Yes.
idea was you wanted to project this, but I
Yes.
wondered if there was at this moment in time.
All data is a bit impossible, but there are quite some tools out there that it's called ghostery. So it's systems or interfaces that allow you at least to see who else is watching when you're, for instance, browsing on a website. And there's lots of research done by media studies scholars and others to kind of, and the digital humanities, to really trace back who is actually watching, how these networks unfold, and they become kind of universes, constellations of nodes and edges. It's with obscure companies that we've never heard of. So this is a very deep dive into a hidden world behind these flashy interfaces, where often it's about data trading in real time, which comes back to the building and the you know, it's on those centers where that trading actually happens in the bits and bytes that are hidden under concrete structures somewhere. And that real-time bidding is, I think they yearly there's NGOs that publish reports on what your data is worth and how it's traded and etc. And it's kind of disappointing. It won't make you rich, all your data, but it's there are ways to find this out, but only to a certain extent. So we only have one infrastructure that actually archives the web, and that's a voluntary institution, right? That's the Internet Archive. And for the rest, it's often behind closed proprietary silos, or is just lost. So the problem of data is also, and that I think is a nice contrast with the brutalist kind of buildings that need to be there forever, that the data and the infrastructure and the software in which all this data is being processed changes almost every year. So if you try to open a website from 1998, forget about it, right? So we think that our data is there forever, but actually it's the opposite. We become kind of, we forget even quicker about our own past. And that is interesting about this data trails. And there's this dystopia that our data lives there forever, but in practice, actually, it's very hard to find data of something forever because there's no value in it, it's being thrown out, it's unfindable, the format has changed, Flash doesn't exist anymore, other formats will. So you see actually that in this whole archiving, which would fit in this kind of monolithic, somewhere in the countryside, forever base, has a very different use and reality to that. So yes, there are tools where you can find out who's checking you, but the downside of that kind of transparency is also that it makes you even more frustrated, because then there's a difference between knowing and acting upon that, right? So does it help you to know who is tracking you, or does it actually not? And what I find interesting is that now also compared to the Apple story, there's new types of internet browser that actually use your privacy argument and to show you who is tracking and this choice. And that are really becoming big, like Brave, for instance, that has started. Because they don't only use the argument of privacy to say we stop you from trackers from tracking you, they also show the sustainability argument. So they show how less energy your search has cost because you're not tracked. Because all these trackers cost a huge amount of data and a huge amount of that are absolutely not necessary. Your first browser back in the day was 70 KBs, and it did the same as now, and it's the size of a movie. And everything that's in between is only commercial trackers. And that is a kind of world that we're now coming back to. And that's also why we need all these big buildings and data centers. The most of it is, from an intrinsic point of view, useless data, because it's about buying behavior and tracking. And then it begs the question, do we really want to save that for eternity in beautiful monolithic buildings, or is there actually something we need to be way more sparse about on what we want to save and what those data centers should hold for future generations, instead of just another, this person wants a blue or gray sweater, right? And that is maybe the information that is not so interesting. So this tracking is also, if you find that out, who is tracking you, then often the reasons for doing so and the type of data will be vast, but not so surprising or not so revealing as we are quite predictable. So there's a double side to that.
It's a good moment to get to the next case study. When we move from the hidden world to the world without humans, to the machine landscape. Narindat, thank you for being with us.
Yeah.
We're going to the final case study. It's presented by Karolina Kowalczyk.
Yes, Bernard, thank you for the introduction. Now I see that the discussion at the table overlaps with what I'm going to show you, but I hope I can still surprise you or something. So, yeah. Machine landscapes. Spaces designed for hosting machines. Spaces in which machines are more important than humans. Tesla factory, where production is driven by AI, or ASML clean rooms where technologically advanced devices are manufactured, can stand for examples of such environments. And so do data centers. Imagine the atmosphere inside AM4 data center in Amsterdam. Imagine yourself standing there in a big room. You can hear the humming of the thousands of servers and the loud ventilation system. It's cold inside, well, a bit like here, because, yeah, the ventilation system needs to make sure that the devices don't get overheated. There are no windows in the room, so it's very difficult to tell the time. Oh, the only light that is coming in is the blue light, LED. That is the one that emits least heat. The environment, as mentioned, is sterile, so the dust cannot disrupt the machines. The data needs to be safe, so you just cannot walk in. The access is restricted. So, taking everything into consideration, everything around you tells you you're not welcome here. Data center is a physical artifact of virtual activity. So one may ask, what is the role of architecture in data centers? In order to answer that question, I will use the diagrams. So starting from the left, you can see the city layout and the services spread around. So you actually need to go to places. In a second one, the second one represents the idea of a building as a machine, or the cross-functioning design approach explored by Rem Koolhaas. In the data center, we have access to many services placed in a cloud. So it stores information, but people are physically taken out of this picture. They became users now, beyond the space and time boundaries. So can data center be the next step in this evolution? Let's take a closer look at the idea of a cloud. Webster Dictionary defines cloud computing as the practice of storing regularly used computer data on multiple servers that can be accessed through the internet. So yeah, correct, that's what the data centers allow us to do. So intuitively, the cloud feels very ephemeral and it feels infinite. But if we take a closer look at it, the building, it's a resource-consuming piece of infrastructure. During the course, we made this model that shows the facade of AM4 data center, but what happens inside is a metaphor, and it's a transition. So the mountain that is down there, it's a sand mountain. It represents the resources from which the structure emerges. Next, you have the platforms on which the servers are located, and everything is connected with cables that ultimately spread and cross the borders of the building. So, once again, as discussed in the introduction, does that mean that architecture has become instrumentalized? Or does it need new forms of expression in order to find its role in hypermodernity? I will leave that question to your reflection now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Carol. Do you join us here?
Yeah.
Carolina, why didn't you answer the last question that you posed yourself?
Yes, so I thought it is a nice question for opening the discussion.
Yes, but you can give it an interpretation of yourself.
Yes, so I think by analyzing the AM4 data center, it became interesting that the facade actually is meaningful and is the only piece that is on the boundary between the urban landscape and what's inside, because people are not allowed inside, but they still use the city and they still see it. But yeah, it's telling them you cannot cross because the moat is in there, so it's a boundary.
Well, yes, it's a boundary, but I think that there's also something to say that whatever they look like, beautiful or not, there's nothing new. And I think that, Dirk, you had an association, right?
Nothing new.
With the Bakema
Yeah,
schemes.
yes, with the diagrams, it's fantastic to see the building as a city and the computer as a city or a building and the cloud even. Yes, I immediately said to Bert, oh, but it's completely like Bakema. Well, what's happening here? Because he also has these same models, and I think also even thinking in those, what is it, metaphorical terms? I don't know,
yeah.
But to think in terms of a city as a building or a system as a building, etc. I think that's very much part of this discourse or thinking. That this is how we try to grasp it, because this is really what we're struggling with. I think you were also pointing this out. We really, sometimes it seems as if we've invented something, but we don't know quite what we invented, and then it's playing back on us. Mm-hmm. So there's, in this sense of how technology is being humanized, we are of course being technologized, and the data center or the architecture of the data center is one of the, what we think of as one of the more extreme examples. But yeah, so I see a lot of continuities at play. Yeah.
Well, you could also investigate it perhaps from a different perspective. When it is true that these data centers are a kind of synthesis of our memory, of everything we know, then there is an association with, at least with a library. The library is something similar, it used to be. There's also a similarity with what we already know with the storehouse, so I indeed start to wonder, there's nothing new, actually.
But that doesn't mean it's the same.
Sorry?
That it's not new doesn't mean it's the same.
No, it's not the same, of course not. No, that's true. How would you approach the similarity of these kind of buildings? Faceless buildings which contain actually everything that we know, all our memories, to architectural precedents?
It's a very good question, because we mentioned it previously before. There is now a shift between what was just these big industrial buildings that are kind of like faceless in no man's land, nobody goes to see them, versus actually having them as part of the integrated environment. It's a very nice example you show of the AM3 and 4 by Bentham Krauw architects in Amsterdam, because it is a beautiful, you can actually be having a very expressive piece of architecture.
Yeah.
representing something that you now use as a visual for where your data is stored. This is one fragment, tiny fragment of the 8 million data centers around the world, which you do not see, which is, again, built in this kind of very traditional industrial style that you wouldn't really think of being anything interesting. The thing with data centers is it's based on very fundamental things. You have a place to store data, you have a place you need to cool the data, and you need power. And once you have this kind of these mixed, if you can create a building which is integrating all those components together in a very seamless, elegant, and quite attractive-looking piece of architecture, that can be a good success. And the relationship with data centers and clean rooms, because you presented the case study of ASML. ASML is this kind of, it's not really a no man's land, I would argue, because there is 16,000 people working on campus there. As well as like in the data centers in Eemshaven, there's like 2,500–3,000 people working in those facilities. So they are a restricted area, let's say, but they're not forbidden areas. And especially for ASML, the clean room factor, the actual high-tech facility, the parts where they actually build the machines for the chips, is one fragment of the total, let's say, the industrial areas which people actually work in, and there's a huge amount of different factors in this. There's the R&D, there's the people that are working in the clean rooms themselves, there's marketing, there's PR, there's the sales. That in itself for a clean room and for these high-tech facilities is really important to take into consideration. So when you talk about the data centers, I don't know, like when you want to talk about data centers as an architecture expression, it is it's one small part of like the overall discussion of what a data center really is, if I could put it like that.
Yeah.
What do we hear?
Yeah.
A car.
Cars going past.
Cars.
Somebody's looking for a parking spot.
Yeah.
Sorry?
Somebody's
They're
looking for a
the
parking spot.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. How would you look at this issue of buildings without people, only with machines?
Yeah, we see it not only in these data centers, but also in what these data centers are used for, right? So, for instance, in the factory floors or in the warehouses, we see a kind of extreme version of boxology where the box is the ideal thing for many things, and also for computing. And so the chip design itself is a square with square kind of connections. And I find it very aesthetically interesting that these buildings also reflect this very hard lines and this very kind of monolithic, clean surfaces, which is representing the technology in itself, the chips and the data part. And on the other hand, it also links back to the first kind of dehumanizing technologies, because it becomes really sterile and boring and non-tactile. And if I look at all these kind of spaces, a data center is not a place it's not a very joyful space to be in, let's say. So you want to be in and out, and that is
But on the contrary, that's what I'm saying. Is like the data center, the physical data center, where the racks and the servers are one entity of the entire
the whole,
data center
of course.
facility. So when you start to design a data center, you're designing. You have to design the facility in which your data is stored, but you're also designing the place where humans work.
Yeah.
So that's where the fun part is. And I've been into many of these data center offices from Amazon and Google, and they are really cool places to be. They are dynamic, they're built, are designed, interior designed to create a creative workspace that you are 90% sitting behind your desk, isolated from the space where you're actually controlling, and then maybe 10% or even 5% of the time you're actually spending in the white space itself. So I think, again, the point is that it's the data centers, the building, where the server is stored, this library, as you were mentioning, is one part, but it's as a design for these kind of facilities. What you see here on the image is like, this is a beautiful example of basically enclosing data. It's like a hard drive that you see. But what is really nice in that building also is the office environment, which is the AM3, where a lot of it's really nice, very sustainable, very nice working environment And that's where the human element is.
Yeah.
But why are we upset that these spaces are not for humans? Most of the world or the universe is not for humans.
Yes, but having this experience of this afternoon makes me long for a clear distinction between the world of things and the world of humans. I don't see that. I don't really see a problem here.
Yeah.
Final remarks before we get to the questions and answers of the audience, if there are questions. Carolina, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Oh, you have to stop, yeah.
Justin, are there questions and answers or questions that we should answer, or? Not so far. Not so far.
Okay.
Okay. Well, if you don't feel the urge to add anything to the discussion.
Yeah,
Dirk.
I like this image. Yeah, there's so many things to discuss, Bernard.
Yeah.
And it's great. I don't know if the people on the other side of the screen get what we are experiencing here, that the space is taken over by skateboarders.
Yeah.
So clearly, functionalism is not the real world, right? It's all maybe also with these spaces. But one of the things that is really interesting, what you and Husni put on the table, is that architecture as a humanist discipline, you don't define humanism so much vis-a-vis nature or the cosmos or universal knowledge. It's you define the human vis-a-vis technology, and the sublime of the technology. And this is something that we really have to come to terms with, or maybe not, but I think this is part of the discussion at the moment.
Well, that's a good final conclusion, Dirk. Thank you very much for that. This has been for all of us one of the more strange experiences in our life, I suppose. We have to live with that. I'm still confused, but at a higher level. Thank you very much for joining me, and also for the audience. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, and have a good day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.